All right, hello everyone. Welcome to Archaea Viking. Today I have a very special guest with me, Taylor Stomer, or is it pronounced Stomer?
Stoermer. It's like I
Stoermer.
was without the O.
Stoermer. Taylor Stoermer, a specialist in a historian who specializes in the American Revolution and public history, and he is joining me today to talk about both public history and also public history as it pertains to the American Revolution. Uh, and I felt this was important because, as Taylor here knows very well, in recent years, really, it's never gone away, but especially in recent years, um, the American Revolution has been used in the public eye as a weapon by multiple different parties for different political gains. So I felt that like bringing somebody on to talk about the American Revolution and its involvement with public history would be very apt in this current political climate. Um, so, with that, Taylor, why don't you introduce yourself? Tell us a little bit about yourself and such.
I guess I'll just give you the short version. I am a lecturer at Johns Hopkins University, where I teach public history and public history practice. I'm also the film and digital media editor for The Public Historian, which is the journal of record for the field. It's published by the National Council on Public History, which is the representative body for public historians in North America, and particularly in the United States. Um, I am. I also have my own studio, but we don't really need to talk too much about that. I before I was at Hopkins, I taught at Harvard and I was a fellow at Harvard. And before that, I was the historian at Colonial Williamsburg, responsible for all of our interpretive programs, all of our academic programs, making sure that we were connecting scholarship to what we were telling visitors, what we were telling the at that time 675 or so thousand people who walked down to Gloucester Street. And so that's kind of where I got my start in public history. My training, though, is as an academic historian. I got my PhD from the University of Virginia, where I specialized in the American Revolution, focusing on Virginia and loyalists and the political economy of tobacco. If you want a suitable substitute for Valium, you can sort of read my works on that.
Yeah.
But then I was also before that I went to Johns Hopkins and Harvard. So that's pretty much up to date. But that's my second life, right? That I actually went to graduate school a little bit later when I was 30, but before that I had a career in national politics in D.C., working in the Senate and working in the
Ah,
House, and I was the communications director for a national political organization. So I had that kind of life until I thought that this one is much more suited to my temperament. So I
yeah.
went back to graduate school, and I was able to make sure I got it all out of the way. And have and end up back where I more or less started, which is Hopkins. It's a wonderful place.
Ah, yeah. So in other words, you were too smart for the U.S. political system, is what
Or
I.
maybe too dumb. I don't know. The one thing about the political system was that that was the first place that I really first saw how an understanding of the American founding actually fit actually fit into um, doing anything, whether you worked in the Hill in legislation or whether you worked off the Hill in political communication. I did both. That you saw people deploying it in different ways, deploying broadly American history in particular ways, but particularly the history of the Constitution, the history of the American Revolution, invoking these symbols, the way that that worked in political communication. And before I went into politics, I went to law school at Tulane in New Orleans,
Mm,
and you're learning about constitutional law there, how constitutional law used to be what courts made of it, and it's got
yeah.
nothing to do with the history of the Constitution until, of course, what recently the Supreme Court has been doing. And so, seeing it from first a legal standpoint, and then seeing it from a legislative standpoint, and then seeing it from the standpoint of political communication, what became very clear to me was just the ways in which it was already being, it wasn't quite being weaponized just yet, not not as robustly as it is today, but how it was being deployed to accomplish particular
Yeah.
political purposes. So it was a tool that people would use, and it didn't have anything to do with the authenticity of their claims. It would just have to do with their kind of tactical rhetorical
Mhm.
deployment of the symbols, and how that was not the it was not the purview of it was not just the purview of the conservatives or the liberals or Republicans or Democrats or wherever you want to describe them. Everybody is doing it, and they're doing it with the same people, and they're basically saying the same things about the same people. And so you have to sort of like recognize the what exactly are the differences and what is the result of those differences. So why are they doing it? So that's actually what led me to want to go back to graduate school and actually figure out. Oh, well, basically it was a what the hell? What actually happened? Let's understand it, and
Yeah.
so that we can know what we're talking about. And then I got into public history because it made a lot more sense because there are all of these people out there who are running around thinking that they have an understanding of the American Revolution. Not their fault that they don't, but
Yeah.
because of the way popular history works on the Revolution and the Constitution, the way that people gain their information, even 15 years ago, is so divorced from academic history. And
Mhm.
then today, where with digital media, and why I think it's the single best way to both to
Mhm.
practice public history, um, is it gives you much more of an opportunity, in fact, to get things right. It gives you lots of opportunity to get things wrong.
Mhm.
But you've got a bigger toolkit for being able to engage audiences. And really, if you're doing public history right, it's about engagement. It means you're listening. It means you're trying to figure out
Mhm.
where people are coming from, and so you can identify actually where the weak points are that you can go and try to strengthen. And that of course leads to things that you and I have talked about in terms of slavery
Yeah.
and indigenous people and sort of their relationships to the
Yeah.
revolution and to the founding.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, and I think that's a very good. With that, let's leave that a segue into like give a broader definition of what public history is, not just necessarily pertaining
Ah,
to the revolution, but
yeah.
just for definition's sake, to define it for the viewers watching the video. Like, how would you define what public history is and such? Which, of course,
Uh,
I would argue includes museums and things like that.
oh yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah, but museums are a place to practice public history.
yeah, yeah.
The public history to me, it's if you think about it as a triad, right, with a public historian at one part of the triangle, your audiences at another part of the triangle, and the past at the other part of the triangle. And what you try to do is bring all these things together. Um, but the definition that I use
Mhm.
is that public history is about telling stories about the past in the present, to audiences, in order to help them understand the past, how it relates to their lives, and in a usable way.
Yeah.
Um, and it differs strikingly from academic history, which is simply about researching, asking questions about the past, engaging in scholarly research about the past, and then bundling that together in what is in fact the product of history, which is an academic article, an academic book, an academic paper, and then that is a contribution to the historiography, the set of literature about a subject, and there you've done your job. And then if you are at all involved in broader engagement, you might do that in a classroom, or you might do that kind of unilaterally. Well, you'll stand in front of a camera or in a lecture hall and you just present what it is to an audience, and it ends there. Public history, though, goes takes all of that, takes the scholarship and connects it with audiences, but does it in a way that helps them, in fact, helps audiences use it, makes it really meaningful in their modern lives, but it does it in a way that privileges the engagement, that is about discussion, that is about the back and forth, that is about the conversation, which is why that museums are places that increasingly do this. But but you can do it online. You can do it through TikTok. You can do it at national parks. You can do it at other historic sites. You can do it if you're just leading a tour of people down the street.
Yeah.
But the key thing has to be about the engagement, which requires you to kind of know where people are coming from, and that's a concept that there are two big concepts that we base it on, and one is shared authority, which presumes that there is no single person that has all the answers to something. That I might have an interpretation of something that is drawn from the scholarship, but that doesn't necessarily mean that that's the last word on it.
Yeah.
That people have their own understanding of what these things mean in their lives, and so you together can in fact come up with what that modern meaning is, because that scholarship might be missing some things. That
Yeah.
scholarship might not have asked that particular question, not have has not responded to that particular point, but it might be something, and this is something that an article in one of Hopkins' publications mentioned the other day, that actually posited that how that it's public history that and public humanities that is coming to the rescue of academic history, and academic and the academic humanities, because we've seen in terms of the data that the drop in the number of undergraduate students who major in those subjects and related subjects like philosophy or art history, that in 2012 it was as high as 32% of all undergraduates were in some measure a humanities major. In 2023, that dropped to 10%. And if you only focus on history, English, art history, and philosophy, it's less than 4% of all undergraduate majors are in one of those subjects, one of those fields. At my own university, it's less than 1%.
Oh,
So,
wow.
but
But
the courses that are full are the courses in the public humanities, are the courses in public history, are the courses in
oh,
public archaeology, and the courses
yeah.
in museum engagement, because it is seen as being a way to not just exercise your interest in history, not just understand historical method, but to also make it usable, also to make it meaningful, to make it work, and to actually make it work for you, quite literally, in terms of getting a job and building a livelihood for yourself. We can't lose track of that, which is why so
Yeah.
many of these are in professional programs. And so in our program, what we stress, for being a good public history historian and recognizing good public history, you've got to do two things. You've got to first be a good historian, or a good enough historian to be able to tell good history from bad. So you've got to understand historiography, you have to understand historical method, you have to understand historical practice, because that is the core of the second part of it, which is you've got to be a good storyteller. You've got to understand narrative design. You've got to understand sort of narrative framework, because that's how people learn. That's how people understand. And that's how you can actually also recognize how somebody else is being fed a story. You can identify sort of the different parts of the story that other people are getting wrong. So you've got to be one part historian, good enough to tell good history from bad history, one part storyteller,
Yep.
and good enough to know good storytelling from bad storytelling. And then you combine those both of those things, and you deploy that to targeted audiences. I mean, the one of the misconceptions about public history is that it's just history outside the classroom, and it's just you talking to everybody. So if you're not talking to students in a classroom, then a public historian just talks to the public. That's a misnomer. If you're trying to talk to everybody, you will talk to nobody. You're not
Yeah.
going to reach everybody. Not everybody. I mean, and you know from the kind of work that you do and the kind of subjects
Yeah.
that you focus on, not everybody speaks the same language.
No. No.
So the kind of audiences that you're looking at are audiences that you target,
Yeah.
whether that is by ethnicity, whether it's by age group, whether it's by other kind of demographics. Is that you've got
Yeah.
to target your audiences, but you combine the best that you can do with the history and the best that you can do with storytelling in whatever format you happen to be doing that, and then you're able to deploy that, and you can, in ways that matter. I mean, one of the things that has been very important, for and why a lot of articles are more people are talking about how public humanities is coming to the rescue of academic history, is one word that I'm sure you've heard a lot, is relevance.
Yeah.
Why does it matter? What's the big so what? But relevance is built into what public history is. That we tell stories about the past and the present that matter, and when we say that, it's not in a kind of abstract way. It is, does this information, does this subject, in fact, impact your life today? Can does it make you see the world around you in a different way today, right now, right after you've had a discussion? And can you therefore do something about that to make your world a better place, or at least to help you understand it better?
Mm.
And so that there are certain things that drive me crazy, that, it's fine to learn more about Anne Boleyn. Um, but does learning more about Anne Boleyn help you understand the world around you? No. Does learning more about about the relationship of slavery to the American Civil War help you understand the world around you? Hell yeah.
Yeah,
That helps you understand how we got from then to now. So
yeah,
there's a big, so there are a number of value judgments that are kind of inserted in our conversation about, there's history that matters, and there's history that doesn't, and the history that doesn't is interesting, and that's cool. But public history, particularly 21st century public history, some people refer to it as activist public history, is all about targeting subjects that in fact have a direct relationship to people's lives today, like the history of the relationship between Israel and Palestinians. I mean, this is
yeah,
this is a history that matters.
yeah, yeah, exactly. Yeah, and to segue off, sort of off the Anne Boleyn thing, I saw somebody on TikTok actually make a good point. It's like, can we please get rid of biopics and biographies a little bit? Because a lot of times when they're not, as you yourself have said on your TikTok channel, they're not very good public history. The most recent example of which being the Napoleon movie, which I have not seen, nor do I have any interest in
Go me too.
seeing. And I think Napoleon's a fascinating person, and his history really does matter because he was such a massive force on it, on history, you know even for what is not necessarily the American Revolution, but the years after it. Because one could argue, I've often argued that really the American Revolution technically didn't end till after the War of 1812, which
Oh, that's fair enough. Yeah.
I will die on the hill with, that we did not win. I'm so tired of hearing that there was a draw. When you look at all the strategic victories that Britain won versus all the strategic victories that America won, Britain dog walked us. They oftentimes try to. I've seen people like, oh, we won just as many battles as they did. It's like, that's not how war works. It's the quality of victory rather than the quantity. And Britain accomplished all of its goals. We did not. But that's, I
Yeah,
digress.
don't throw Lundy's Lane at me. Okay,
Yeah,
we've got more things to talk about in terms of
yeah,
that context. But
yeah,
and you're right. I mean, I agree
yeah.
with you.
Yeah. So yeah, exactly. So it's just one of those things where it's just like, but he had such an impact on it. But then you have movies like Napoleon, which is just not at all accurate to what he did in his life. Even a little bit from what I understand.
Well,
Um,
I think that your main point about all of the reasons why
yeah,
Napoleon
yeah,
matters and why
yeah,
understanding Napoleon matters, the creation of the civil code, the kind of
yeah.
things that his reorganization of Europe, which leads to the age of European revolutions
Revolution.
right after that,
Yeah, and
to the
yeah,
various restorations. Anyway, all of the things that he in fact was important for. You won't get out of this movie. They don't even talk about them. They don't care
yeah,
about them. The only reason why Napoleon is important is because of his relationship with Josephine, apparently. But
yeah,
so you're not going to
yeah,
learn anything about why he was, in fact, you're not
yeah,
even going to get a hint about why he, in fact, mattered.
yeah,
Other than he had all of these battles, but you don't get to see, okay, what did the battles result in? The battles resulted in redrawing the map of Europe.
yeah,
And that
yeah,
redrawing of the map led to later redrawings in all kinds of ways, and you can't underestimate the importance of the creation of the civil code, which is
yeah.
still used by a third of the world's population and stuff.
Yeah, yeah, and exactly. And showing battles in movies and talking about battles in public history is not inherently bad, as long as you put a context to them. Just showing people running at each other and shooting guns at each other, like
Lots of shouting.
lots of shouting, like,
Yeah.
for example, the Patriot portrays and things like that. That's not the way to do it. It's like, if you're going to portray, for example, Napoleon's battles, you know, actually explored why he was successful. Why his military, tactics were revolutionary. I mean, yes, he was eventually defeated, but it took, I forget how many coalitions. I think like 12, 7 or 8 different coalitions to defeat him. And it's like that he was a skilled strategist. So if you're going to show his battle, do that. Or for example, when to go just very briefly away from the American Revolution, when you're talking about something like say the Mongol Empire and why the Mongol Empire was successful, you have to inherently talk about their military tactics because they by and large had, for the most part, much smaller armies than say Persia or China or any of the other empires they came across. So you have to be like, well, how did this small little country become this huge empire? And it's like, well, it's because of the tactics and political things that they use. So going back to Napoleon and the American Revolution, that's how you use the battles and
Yeah,
such in that context, not just showing people running at each other
yeah.
and Joaquin Phoenix or in the case of the Patriot, Mel Gibson, you just standing there all bloodied in the middle of this chaotic battlefield, which is not actually how battlefields were a lot of the time, anyways. So,
Well, and it comes down to what it is. What is it? And this is what
yeah,
sources like that, whether it's a theatrical film or whether it's a book, that there's a reason biography is a separate
yeah,
genre. But it comes down to what you think actually makes history. And
yeah,
when I say that is, what do you think in fact creates change over time or makes things stay the same over time? And so for your example about the Mongol Empire, I mean, it is the deployment of this military force that does that. So you need to understand that
yeah,
that creates change or stasis over time. What or there are other historians who will argue argue not about the Mongol Empire, but in other contexts, like the American Revolution, for example, that no, actually, it's about ideas.
yeah,
Ideas are the only thing that matter over time. Ideas are the only things with sufficient power to actually create meaningful change. So it's only the ideas that matter, and therefore only the people who develop, articulate, and maintain those and deploy those ideas that matter. And then you have other people say, no, 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 people who are Marxist historians or that
yeah,
there's a different kind of causality to history. No, it's really about class struggle. It's about bottom up. It's about we need to look at what's going on in terms of the suppression of others. About that will drive history. That recognition of the constant conflict between capital and labor. That's actually what drives history. I mean, it's that kind of thing. So when you get into biography, though, and I learned this my first week of graduate school, and I learned might be too soft a way to put it, drilled into me. Biography is terrible history
yeah,
because you can't get the one thing that historians and archaeologists have to provide, and you guys do it literally, right? I
yeah,
mean, context. Which is
yeah.
why I think that archaeology is a wonderful way for historians to understand what it is
I've,
that they do.
I've
Um,
actually pause right there. I've actually argued for years that I feel like at least a minor in archaeology should eventually become a requirement for completing a history degree. But it's
I gotta tell you, the best thing I ever did in graduate school was do a field school.
yeah,
I did a field school
at
at
the
Mount
very
Vernon.
least, yeah,
In my first summer of graduate school, I did a field school at Mount Vernon just to understand the methodology so
yeah,
that I could bring a kind of interdisciplinary approach even that early. But I really wanted to understand the methodology, and you don't understand it unless you're actually on your knees scraping the ground.
yeah,
But seeing that language, the language that historians often use, but seeing that language deployed so directly and so clearly, whether it's as long as you're maintaining the difference between provenience and provenance, which you'll screw up
yes,
any historian. Archaeologists
yeah,
get that straight, historians don't.
yeah, yeah,
But to understand context, even just to understand the process of layers and reading layers and recording, that there is a direct cognate to historical practice. Now,
yeah,
but getting back to our original point,
yeah,
biographers don't do that.
yeah,
Biographers are essentially they're Schliemann. They'll just cut a trench, and they're just cutting that trench through all the layers to get at what they want to get at. by focusing on their one goal, which is telling the story through John Adams' eyes or Thomas Jefferson's eyes or Genghis Khan's eyes, to the extent that there are any resources about it. You know what?
Yeah.
You're gonna focus on that. So it's impossible for you to actually situate that individual in the broader context of their world, because you inevitably will lose any kind of trace of their significance within that context. You got to keep going from high point to high point. It's like watching a figure skating,
Yeah.
and just waiting for the jumps. There you go. Then you can just that's all biography is, and
Yeah.
that's and that it's not good history because you're just
Yeah.
getting it from the standpoint of one person. That's why the folks who engage in serial biographies, who will write biographies about people from shockingly different periods. So you write a book about John Adams, you write a book about Theodore Roosevelt, you write a book about Harry Truman. No one is qualified to actually understand the periods in which each of those three people lived.
Yeah.
You can spend your whole life working on this and not understand one of them, much less understand all three of them.
Yeah.
Um, and so that's why you really got to ask, okay, well, where is this person getting the information, the context? So they're not doing it on their own. If they have to educate themselves about the person that they're studying, this is Ridley Scott and Napoleon, right? Is that
Yeah.
he doesn't know anything about Napoleon himself. He read a book, and contacted the historian who wrote that book, and then had his screenwriter write a script based on that book, and then make changes to it based upon Ridley Scott's own point of view, leaving the book and that historian far behind. So what do you do with that?
Yeah, exactly. Well, another good example of that, and I watched an interview. It was very similar. I watched an interview with, and I can never remember his name, but the guy who played the villain in Patriot, Tarleton. Um,
Oh, Jason Isaacs.
yeah, Jason Isaacs, and he was talking
Oh yeah,
about
he's a wicked good actor.
yeah. Well, he was talking about how, of course, Gibson had a Revolutionary War historian on set, but he never actually consulted him. Isaacson was like, yeah, he's like, I would actually like constantly, because he's British, so I would constantly, just genuinely curious, go up to him and ask him questions like, oh, did this actually happen that way or this and that? And he's like, and after so many times of just hearing no, it didn't happen that way, he's like, I asked him, well, why are you here? And he's like, the historian said, probably just so they could say that they had a Revolutionary War historian on staff.
Yeah, I mean, I was a historical advisor for, I've been a historical advisor for a couple of films, but the one I was most closely associated with is one of the Pirates of the Caribbean movies.
Oh, okay.
And but it's why do you need a historian for the Pirates of the Caribbean movies? And I've been on set, but I had absolutely all of the work that I did was I did a lot of work sort of with the individual actors, before shooting,
Yeah,
and then you're on set for shooting, and I had no expectation whatsoever that anything that I said was mattering to anybody. So
yeah,
I didn't even bother. I mean, it was nifty to be there, and I sort of liked sort of
yeah,
soaking up the environment,
yeah,
sort of interacting with the crew and some with the cast and crew. But I asked no questions about what was going on. I was asked no questions about what was
yeah,
going on. I was fine with it because if you assume, unlike the Patriot, right,
yeah. Unlike the
which
Patriot,
is specifically marketed
as a
as being representative of the American Revolution. The director marketed it
yeah,
that way. Like Napoleon is being marketed as this is an
yeah,
authentic representation of Napoleon, which is why you want to go watch it. Nobody is going to watch Pirates of the Caribbean expecting that. Did Krakens really do that?
yeah, yeah. It's like, was Davy Jones actually an octopus person? Yeah,
Yeah, exactly. So,
yeah,
all right, fine.
yeah,
I'll tell you about a flintlock.
yeah, yeah. It's
That's
like, yeah, I'm
fine.
not expecting. Yeah, exactly. And I do want to, before we move on to the revolution part of it, I do want to add on to the statement that there are very there are exceptions to the biography rule. There are very
Yeah.
good accurate biographies out there. I've got a couple on my shelf. One is about William Marshall, who is like often
Mm.
called the greatest knight And it talks about his life, but it also goes into context about like what it actually meant to be a knight, like the training, you know, the tournament circuit, all, and it talks about other people who he existed with at the time and sort of that, you know, things like that. It doesn't necessarily go from his perspective. It just says, okay, this is his life. Here's the world he grew up in. Here's what he did. Here's why he did what he did. Here's sort of how the culture worked and things like that. And you know, and then you have things like, for example, I've got another one I've got is the biography on about Osceola, who is a
Oh, sure.
yeah, who yeah, and it again goes into a very similar thing because um, it's you have to, in order to understand him and why he eventually started the Second Seminole War, or he was one of the several people who started the Second Seminole War. He was the main one, but he wasn't the only one. But you have to go into the context of the world and also explain, like essentially you have to explain, hey, Andrew Jackson was a jackass, he was a dick.
Let's start there.
Yeah, let's start there. It actually does. It actually starts with Andrew Jackson pursuing the remnants of the Red Stick Creeks into Florida, which is what happened
Yeah.
after the Creek War. So so there are exceptions to the rule, but and I've got another one that's also very good about Frederick Townsend Ward, who was an American sailor who eventually sort of helped restructure the Chinese military during the
Oh,
Taiping
interesting.
uprising. He's not the only one. There was a Chinese individual by the name of Zheng Guofeng who also did it. They sort of did it independently of each other, but
Yeah.
also used very similar methods, which is sort of one of the key things about the biographies. Like his methods were not unique. It's just he just happened to rise up at the same time, and he and this other guy were doing it at the same time, and yada yada yada.
Well,
But all
I mean,
that,
and you're exactly showing the
yeah,
where biography, or at least a
yeah,
biographical approach, can be really
yeah,
valuable in understanding history. Is that when you are, when you're talking about Ward, or whether you're talking about Osceola,
yeah,
that these are people whom you need to understand to unlock a
yeah,
broader understanding of these periods. We
yeah,
don't need we don't need a 211th biography of Thomas Jefferson or
yeah,
Abraham Lincoln, but what we do need are those are is that kind of work that will in fact pick out these people who are key to understanding little
yeah,
understood but incredibly important moments. If we see American history as being one in which voices have been suppressed, in which
yeah,
there have been silences that have been imposed, go into those silences and pick out somebody like Osceola is a wonderful example.
yeah,
Pick them out, center their story,
yeah,
and just that one act, just that one approach will help you see that period of history and those historical developments in a much different way and spark new questions and a new conversation. So you're absolutely right. If you've got a biography or or a historian who's taking a biographical approach, that can use
yeah,
telling the story about a person to unlock the broader story that they represent. And I mean, there are few people that you're more important than somebody like Osceola, right? I mean,
yeah,
we need to understand the forced removal of indigenous peoples from the
yeah,
southeast. We have to, and what that means for broader American history properly understood. But you don't do that by reading another biography of Andrew Jackson.
yeah,
You know?
exactly. Yeah, well, and then another good example of that. I have on my shelf. I have a very very good biography about somebody that I frankly think should be paid more attention to than Andrew Jackson. One of his main political rivals, Davy Crockett. Davy
Oh,
Crockett,
sure.
because the thing is, Davy Crockett. We've all we grew up with the King of the Wild. Sorry, people my age and Stoermer's age grew up with Davy Crockett, King of the Wild Frontier, but that's not actually how he was. The thing,
Sure.
that when because the line of the West, the biography I've got about Davy Crockett, actually talks about it talks about his life, but it also talks about his relationship one with the Native Americans and his political fight, and in context with like say Indian removal, and also his bitter rivalry with Andrew Jackson, and puts that into context as well because Andrew Jackson portrayed himself as a man of the people, but was really a wealthy plantation owner. Meanwhile, Davy Crockett grew up poor and was legitimately a man of the people. And so it sort of goes into like, oh, this is why Crockett eventually left for Texas, because every time he tried to push something through Congress to benefit the people of Tennessee, Andrew Jackson and his cronies would just smack it right back down and, you leave it at that. So, but then in contrast, because at the same time I bought that biography, I bought another biography about Davy Crockett. And all it was just talking about, oh, look at him in, movies and TV and this, that, and the other.
Yeah.
I'm just like, I don't care about, you know, him in movies or
So you
TV.
don't care about Walt Disney's Davy
Yeah.
Crockett.
Well,
That's
and
what
it
I'm
was
talking
like
about.
talking about, oh, we visited the Alamo and toured the museum. And I'm just like, I don't care. I've been to the Alamo and I like the Alamo, but like, I don't care about, oh, sorry, let me rephrase that. I care about David Crockett in context with the Texas Revolution and why he went and things like that and why he fought, and eventually the Alamo. But I don't care about like him in context with the Alamo Museum that is currently up. And that's so oftentimes you can have a good biography about somebody because there are good biographies, for example, about say Thomas Jefferson or Andrew Jackson, but then you have very crappy ones right there waiting in the wings, and they don't. And you can't. For the longest time, you couldn't decide whether or not they were crappy or not. Now you have
Yeah.
reviews and people on say TikTok or YouTube being like, "Hey, don't buy this book," you know, but that's not always the case. So that's another reason that I think uh, biography doesn't necessarily go away, but we need to have less of them because
Yeah.
it makes it very difficult to tell which one is good or bad because there are so many.
Well,
You
there's
know,
I mean there's a big difference between it being a hagiography,
yeah,
right?
yeah,
It just being a celebration of what you think are the great things about somebody who can do no wrong, I mean,
yeah,
like a life of a saint,
yeah,
or an in fact critical biography.
yeah,
That understands enough of the context to really be able to understand how a person is related to the developments of their time and isn't and is willing to say
yeah,
so,
yeah, exactly.
rather than kind of exploding their meaning, because but that's a part of a problem with publishing. It's part of a problem with broadcast media. I mean, it is, you have to inflate any person's sense of importance in order for they producers and authors think, in order for people to buy it. Why would you buy a 400 book on anybody if it's not critical for understanding what America is, or critical
Yeah.
for understanding the Civil War? I mean, it's absolutely ridiculous. There are two documentaries that I watched recently, both of the same subject. One was done in 2000. They're both about Nat Turner,
Oh, Nat Turner.
and the one was done in 2003, and one was done just in 2016. The 2016 done was one was produced by National Geographic, in support of a film that came out in 2016, about Nat Turner's Rebellion. And then the other one, again, was 2003, and it was independently produced by a black filmmaker, who's legendary, right? And that film ends up on the lists of best documentaries ever made.
Oh,
Whereas the 2016 documentary is an absolute mess. And then you look at who's making it, like who the director is, and the director basically is known for things like Booze Traveler.
wow.
And so so this is like looking at the author of a biography, who in fact is producing this stuff. What is its utility? What's its purpose? And
Yeah.
who's creating it? So if you want kind of a Booze Traveler approach to Nat Turner and his rebellion, versus what a thoughtful black filmmaker did in
Yeah.
2003,
Yeah.
you can really see the different purposes that are
Yeah.
involved, rather than kind of, let's connect the dots, let's get a whole bunch of people with big names, let's go ahead and record them saying these names, let's create this. I can't get off the Booze Traveler thing. I mean,
Yeah.
and you take the subject, and basically you just turn it into a mash. Whereas you can actually, at your point about biographies, these things can be deployed in really, really useful ways to help you understand not just individuals, but the best biographies will really help you understand that individual's relationship with the broader context of their period.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. And I think that's, those exist. You just given how many biographies are out there and how many of them are bad, it's hard
Oh
to
yeah.
find them. And so, yeah. So please, anyone watching who is thinking of doing a biography, either, like, let's take a break from biographies for a little while because there are good ones out there. Just give it time for people to actually find the good ones. And also, I would say, just to end it off on, if a biography is so good, if it's as good as, say, American Lion or the book on William Marshall, The Greatest Night, and things like that, maybe you don't need to make any more biographies if it's already gotten all the
Well,
information.
that's it,
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
That a lot of folks like they're
yeah,
like, for example, like Thomas Jefferson,
yeah,
that they're don't don't assume that just because something is new that it's better,
yeah, exactly.
or just because something is old that it's worse. I mean, all history projects, all biographical biography projects, they are in large measure a product of their times.
Yeah,
But that doesn't mean that there isn't a considerable value. So, in my view, the best single biography of Thomas Jefferson is written by Merrill Peterson. It's called Thomas Jefferson and a New Nation.
okay,
It gives you in one volume, it's a doorstop, but it gives you in one volume um, everything you need to know about Thomas Jefferson and his world. You are good to go. Then you can sort of build out from that to understand his relationship with Sally Hemings. That's more modern work. You can ask questions about where he goes wrong based upon what he knew at the time. But he's fair about Jefferson, and that book. So I'm looking at it now, and that book's got to be 60 years old.
yeah,
But there are other books like this book, which I've been digging into a little bit lately. One of my favorite historians, she passed away a couple of years ago. Her name is Pauline Maier, and she's kind of the historian for today, right? If that this is the time that she really should be around for, and
yeah,
she's a historian of the founding. She's a historian of the Revolution, a historian of the Constitution, and she wrote this book called "The Old Revolutionaries." Let's see if I can
yeah.
sort of
I
get in the
see.
light.
Yeah,
Political Lives in the Age of Samuel Adams. Now, Pauline is not a biographer, but what she wanted to do, and a question she wanted to answer, is why did the revolutionaries, the early patriots, who actually were the primary motivators of the movement for independence, why were they not a part of the later revolution, the later constitution? Why did they fade away? People whom are, more or less household names, Samuel Adams, people like that. Why did they fade away?
yeah,
And that's a historical question now. So what she did was she did this collective biography approach. So there are chapters in here about about Samuel Adams, about Richard Henry Lee, and others. And so she's able to take in a really manageable way, um, do these kind of potted biographies about these individuals that relate them to the historical question that she's trying to answer, which is, what the hell? Why did they just exit the scene? So by the time you get to the end of the War for Independence, and certainly by the time you get to the Constitution, the core of the people who drove the independence movement aren't a part of it. And in
yeah,
fact, most of them oppose the Constitution. They are, so you've got to kind of reconcile this question. You can't be, so if you want to understand Samuel Adams as being the great patriot, yeah, he was. And yeah, he's an interesting person. You've got to understand him to understand the war, the movement for independence, particularly in New England. But you also have to understand what it means for the American Revolution and for the Constitution that he was no longer part of it.
yeah,
And so it's that kind of thing. So you can do it in broad ways and understand that. And this book has got to be, this is this is probably 40, 50 years old too.
yeah,
Is understand first, look at, for your viewers, look at who's writing it,
yeah,
and get an idea of why they're writing it. What really is the contribution they want to make? If they're not a historian, if they're, for example, a journalist who's turning to history and biography in order to
or
accomplish other goals,
or
then maybe take a pass.
Creme Hancock. Uh, sorry, the
That's legit. Come on.
It's a legit thing. It's more archaeology related than history related, but they go hand in hand. Yeah, yeah. So with that, let's talking about atoms and the founders. With that, let's go into what let's go into the revolution when it comes to public history and its
Yeah.
portrayal and things like that. Because well, the Patriots one of the biggest examples. Not the only one, but nor is it necessarily. I would argue it's not necessarily the worst. It's not great. It's pretty terrible, but it's not necessarily the one of the
Oh, it's
worst.
bad. It's come
It's
on.
it's terrible.
It's pretty terrible.
But I've seen a lot.
Have you seen worse?
Yes, I
Gosh, I
have.
want you to send me worse. If it
I've
gets
seen
worse than the Patriot, I want to see that.
Oh, I've seen worse. I've seen worse. I've seen worse when
Drums along the Mohawk.
yeah, drums along the Mohawk. I've also seen things written and produced by like people like what was it like Rush Limbaugh and shit like that.
Oh gosh, Bill O'Reilly.
Yeah,
Yeah,
Bill O'Reilly. You know, so it's and there are older movies that
fair
aren't
enough.
really there are older movies that aren't great that some people like. I was shown like a well, that sort of musical movie about the Revolutionary War, and like we're in it, at some point. Thomas Jefferson, he's having writer's block, and he doesn't get the writer's block fixed until his wife
Oh,
comes.
1776.
Yeah,
Yeah, yeah.
and it's heavily implied that they go
He
and
needs to be unblocked in
yeah,
order for his mind to get unblocked. Yeah,
which is like that's pretty bad.
yeah, yeah.
It's like it's so like I said, I've seen some pretty bad ones. So there are quite a lot. And then there are some that are that are much more mixed. For example, I had my son a year or so ago, part of his school, learning history. I had him sit down. I looked up the PBS's The Liberty Kids, as imperfect as it
Oh,
is,
sure. Actually, it's
and
pretty good.
watch it.
It's not bad.
Yeah, yeah, it's pretty good. Yeah, there are some things that I don't like about it. Like it again portrays Thomas Jefferson basically saying, "Yeah, slavery is bad, but we need slavery for the U.S." And that's a paraphrase, but that's sort of what happens in the episode. And he sort of points at the kid main character. He's like, "But maybe in future generations, And it's just like, okay, PBS, like you're taking Jefferson's words a little too literally
Yeah.
here. But then in other cases, it shows Joseph Brant,
Oh,
Joseph Brant, and it shows the raid into his territory by Continental forces,
uh,
and instead of portraying it through the eyes of the Continental forces, the main protagonist, the main male protagonist, because the main male protagonist, is a journalist, and he's sent in there to sort of, follow the Continental forces, and at some point he gets separated, and he runs into this Mohawk individual whom he doesn't know is Joseph Brant, but Joseph Brant is, talking to him, and he's like, hey, hey, maybe Joseph joined the British because he had both sides were a bad deal, but one was less worse than the other, and now he's having just suffer with the consequences,
yeah.
and things like that.
But you have to
Uh,
explain. You have to
yeah,
explain Joseph Brent, right? I
yeah,
mean,
yeah,
explain the choices that he
yeah,
made,
yeah,
and having kids at least understand
yeah.
that is in fact a big um,
Hmm.
part of the story
Yeah,
of the revolution and the war for independence. These are different things.
yeah,
That what Brant represents. And Brant's, talk about people who really deserve more attention.
yeah,
Mary Brant, I mean Joseph Brant. I mean the entire that there desperately needs to be an indigenous history of the American Revolution.
yeah,
That is from the indigenous perspective, because all these books, you mentioned Colin Calloway before,
yeah,
and
yeah,
Colin Calloway's work is terrific.
yeah,
Um, but there is, and I mean, there are a number of historians who've done really good work, but they're all white male
yeah,
European historians, or
yeah,
American historians,
exactly.
and so there has not yet been a comprehensive, because it's tough, right? I mean, you know better
Yeah,
than I do. I mean, it's
yeah,
tough to do because the indigenous peoples are not. you can't just aggregate them, right? You have to disaggregate them to
Yeah,
understand their individual relationships of these peoples. But there needs to be a series of histories from the indigenous perspective to
perspective.
understand why so many end up in Canada. Why do they end up in Canada?
Yeah,
Well, why do they
exactly.
side with the British? Why do they?
Yeah,
Why are they loyalists? Why do they make that? With the kind of work that I do, why you look at behavior,
yeah,
these are not easy things to do.
yeah.
Why do it?
Yeah, exactly. Well, and not only that, even to go on that, they're all white. They're all white men. Um, I've got a very good book right here. See if I can get it into the light here, the correct way. Um, and when you can see it,
Oh
uh,
yeah.
Carolina in Crisis: Cherokee Colonists and Slaves in the American Southeast, which does pertain to the American Revolution, which I'll talk about in a second. But one of it's a very good book and it's in very good detail. And so, for those of you who don't know, it's about this book by Daniel J. Tortora is about the Anglo-Cherokee War, which essentially the Anglo-Cherokee War was a war that sort of happened on accident, where so the Cherokee during the 7 Years' War or the French and Indian War, because they're the same thing technically. I mean, there's one they're also sort of different conflicts because the French and Indian War went a little bit longer than the 7 Years' War, but they're it anyways. It's a whole nother thing. But the Cherokee were allies of the British during this point in time and went on campaign with them to besiege a French fort during the 7 Years' War. But on their way back to Cherokee territory, um, they were attacked by South Carolina colonists for a variety of different reasons. Some claim that the Cherokee uh, stole some horses. Some just, attacked them because they wanted Cherokee land. And then the Cherokee tried to do this legally and, say, hey, we want to, this is ridiculous. We're your allies. Do something about, England, do something about your people, about your citizens who are attacking us. And then nothing ever happened. And so the Cherokees were like, fine, we're going to take this into our own hands, and proceeded to uh, besiege and take a bunch of British forts and things like that. Where my issue with the book comes in is the conclusion that Tortora comes to, and he concludes that the Cherokee actually lost the Anglo-American War, the Anglo-Cherokee War. My issue with that is when you the course of the war was the Cherokee, took all those forts, and then the British sent a colonel with several militia into Cherokee territory, and they were promptly ambushed and suffered heavy casualties. And then the second expedition that included a person who was very famous, and I would argue unnecessarily so, because he wasn't actually that important in the grand scheme of the American Revolution. Um, Francis Marion was a member of this expedition, and what happened is they didn't actually run into any Cherokee on the way, and then they came to Cherokee villages that were already abandoned. And all they did was
Mm-hmm.
burn them, and then they promptly marched back into British territory while being ambushed by Cherokee on the way and suffering several casualties. And they returned and they essentially said, "We won!" But that doesn't sound like a victory,
Right.
especially when there's a very good paper by I forget the author, but it's called Fortify or Flee, and it puts the Anglo-Cherokee War in context with the Tuscarora War, and
Oh sure.
sort of compares the
That makes sense.
strategies used. Whereas in the Tuscarora War, the Tuscarora tried to hold off the British using forts. And actually, the author goes in with archaeology and actually excavated the forts,
Oh.
the Tuscarora forts of the Tuscarora War, and he determined that they were just as sturdily built, if not a little bit more, little bit stronger than British forts. But the issue is they didn't have any cannons. And the Cherokee were again on the British side during that war, so the Cherokee, uh, as well as the Muskogee Creek and other allied Native American tribes that fought on the side of the British, they develop a strategy called is sort of that he calls the flee strategy, which is you leave the villages because you know that you can't stand up to cannons, and you disperse into the woods and resort to ambush warfare. So it's
Mhm.
like while these villages were found emptied, the Cherokee weren't surrendering or running away. They were just using a strategy that they specifically developed
Yeah.
to fight European armies, and then proceeded to harass the British army all the way back to England. And then only a year or so after that, a couple of years after that, the proclamation of 1763 happened, where
Right.
and it was also in conjunction with Pontiac's War, because Pontiac's War happened just a couple years after also.
Yeah.
So the Anglo-Cherokee War and Pontiac's War both led to the proclamation of 1763 that led.
Which you can make an argument is a win for indigenous people.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. Yeah. So which led to, like, the for those of you watching, proclamation of 1763, which I talk about in my video on the American Revolution.
Oh, good.
Um, and I also talk about the Anglo-Cherokee War. The proclamation of 1763 prohibits, at least on paper, English settlement across the Appalachian Mountains. Now, and the British did try to enforce it. I mean, it was a little difficult to enforce, because how do you enforce an entire,
Well, right,
mountain
and
range?
it was a mess to try to it was a
Yeah,
the implementation of it was such a mess because they
yeah,
empowered these agents to go ahead and
yeah,
engage in negotiations
yeah,
colony by colony in
yeah,
order to establish actually where that border lay,
yeah,
and these things didn't get done until, I mean, by the time the revolution started
yeah,
they
exactly,
weren't
exactly.
completed. So there was no actual, one
Yeah,
of the myths is that there's a line. There's no line.
yeah, yeah,
There's no, you can't go beyond here. That was never actually established. So
yeah,
the
exactly.
implementation was a hash, as if they were going to get any kind of colonial cooperation in this in the first place,
Yeah,
not from the expansionists.
yeah, exactly. But that being as may, I argue that, because that essentially, I argue that the Cherokee won the Anglo Cherokee War, albeit it was a Pyrrhic victory, or a victory that cost them more than they gained, but it was still a victory nonetheless.
Yeah,
The British claimed to win, but just because they claim to win in the documents doesn't
no,
mean the same thing when you examine the course of the war, and it's just like, no, the Cherokee won. Now, yes, the Cherokee, because their villages were burnt and their crops were burned, they eventually suffered from a famine later on in the year, and things like that. But that's neither here nor there, because the war was already over. It's the war. The course of the war is the course of the war.
yeah.
And so
And
so
that's why
yeah,
when you're talking about this stuff or
yeah,
any of these kind of historical events, I mean, you
yeah,
have and people and historians want to argue about losses and wins, right?
yeah,
That is that you've got to make sure that you can define what that means and for
yeah,
who, and what that means within the context, what that means within the culture, what that means
yeah,
that I always find that language of win, whether you win or lost, to be too much like talking about sports.
yeah,
There isn't a scoreboard in history.
yeah, yeah, exactly.
There are determinative events. The Treaty of Paris that ends the War for Independence. Okay, that's a determinative event, right? That actually
Yeah,
determines separation. But there isn't when you're talking, you gave a wonderful example about how that language fails to try
yeah,
to understand, in fact, what happened, what the consequences were, and were the consequences more negative for one group than they were for another, more positive for one group than they were for another, or is it kind of mixed depending upon your
yeah,
perspective? You're and throwing in how this results in the. Well, I mean, one of the products of this is the proclamation of
yeah,
1763. There is no doubt that the British government want an end to these conflicts,
yeah,
and they think that this is a way to end these conflicts. They want to stop them. They want to stop
yeah,
hemorrhaging money. They want to stop hemorrhaging forces. They want to stop them, and they recognize the value and the sovereignty
yeah,
of these peoples. And so let's try to get these done, not understanding the absolute absence of any kind of support they're going to get on the ground
yeah, exactly. Which
in the British American colonies to actually
which
do anything about
which
it.
actually it leads me to, I'm put a pin in that for 1 second, and because I want to jump onto something. You talked recently in your TikTok videos about why King Philip's War
Yeah.
matters more for example, the eventual American Revolution versus Bacon's Rebellion, which I agree. But so why don't you explain your reasoning for that to here for a second, and why one matters more for what eventually became the American Revolution than the other.
Well, I don't think it's a zero-sum game.
Yeah,
I think the way that historians have talked about them um, inflate Bacon's rebellion, mainly because of what they think that it, particularly recent historians, because they inflate the role that the consequences it has for race relations between whites and blacks, and that writ large is you can draw a straight line from 1676 to 1776, and that's in no way the case. And the that it but what it does and the but why they both what they both are important for, and what does in fact lead to the preconditions of the American Revolution are what they say about indigenous relationships.
yeah,
Bacon's rebellion is triggered because Bacon and his followers want more control over trade with indigenous people, but they also want fewer indigenous people in the settled areas. And that has a lot more to do with the relationships of people in New England, where I live, to indigenous peoples. Now, the one of the things that Bacon argued was that there needs to be greater militarization of the population of the white population, or the population at large, against indigenous people, pointing to King Philip's War. Well, at least pointing to what Metacomet is doing in terms of the raids on New
yeah,
England settlements. That he's saying, okay, look, the New Englanders are not armed enough,
yeah,
and so they are more liable to suffering the predations of the Wampanoag and Narragansett. And then but Bacon's whole thing is about indigenous people wanting control over indigenous trade, wanting to go ahead and push indigenous people out. I mean, one of his big goals,
mhm,
one of his four stated aims, is to outlaw all indigenous peoples,
yeah,
to enable English Virginians to just kill them at will without
yeah,
any repercussions whatsoever.
yeah,
Um, and that is in practice what is going on in New England. Certainly, when we're talking about, what one of my posts were about, the Great Swamp Massacre.
or the Pequot War.
Yeah, well, the Pequot Wars, that's exactly part of the same sort of set of circumstances. So
Yeah,
when we're talking about what we want to do to draw a line between that and the preconditions of the I've got to separate out the American Revolution and the War for Independence, because I think they're different things.
yeah,
Um, I mean, I think that the War for Independence, all of the 250th anniversary commemorations, those are all about the War for Independence, and that is, as you pointed out, that's from April 1775 to 1814.
yeah,
When final proper independence from Great Britain, economic,
yeah,
political, social, cultural independence is achieved is in 1814. That's the period of the War for Independence. But the American Revolution is something else. The American Revolution starts in the 1760s, and it kind of ends in the Constitution, because
yeah,
the reasons for the revolution, the cultural change, the social change, the political change that kind of inform it, that's all petered out by then. Some people argue that it's petered out by the middle of the war.
yeah,
But this idea about being able to, what it absolutely sets in stone, both King Philip's War and Bacon's Rebellion, is absolutely sets in stone, is the end of any kind of even smell of cooperation
yeah,
with indigenous peoples. It is over. That is what I've called, it is the end of the beginning. It is the end of that phase that starts in 1607. You can push it back to 1588 to Roanoke, but it ends that period of tense accommodation between the European colonizers and between indigenous peoples. And when after 1676, it becomes, basically the populations are decimated,
yeah,
in the European settled areas. So they increase. It's really interesting to see how they increase in terms of symbolic values, because
yeah,
nobody sees them anymore. Not in the settled areas.
yeah,
They're all pushed west. And so there is a much different idea about what they mean in terms of civilization, what they mean in terms of savagery, what they mean in terms of the kind of language that ends up being key to ideas that inform the revolution, because no longer do you really have an immediate indigenous presence. The only presence that you have that is has a marked difference is between whites and blacks, or just the legal status of between free and enslaved people.
Yeah. Well,
So
yeah,
it's a problem.
yes, and now that actually leads me to the pin I stuck in just a second ago. So going off of the Bacon's Rebellion and your point, which is the main point I wanted to point out. Oftentimes when we hear about Bacon's Rebellion, and I've addressed this to people on TikTok before, because where they tried to be like, oh, Bacon's Rebellion was so great because he undid indentured servitude, and he was like, oh, we races need to work together, which is like
No, I
not
didn't.
like, no, yeah. No, he didn't. Yeah, well, and I brought that up in the Native American thing, and the thing is, there was a war in the colonies that eventually led to the end of one type of servitude or slavery and led to the increase of African chattel slavery. But the thing is, it wasn't Bacon's Rebellion. It's one that I would argue is far too often overlooked in favor of Bacon's Rebellion, even though Bacon's Rebellion only happened 30 years, sorry, 40 years before it, and that is the Tuscarora War.
Oh, sure.
The
Yeah.
Tuscarora War. So
Yeah.
the Tuscarora War, for those of you watching, I've done a video on my channel, and you can find it in one of my playlists. The Tuscarora War was this conflict that happened between the Tuscarora tribe, which was a very large tribal nation that still exists, but it's now since moved up to it exists in North Carolina and I believe Canada now, or New York. I'm not exactly sure. Members of the Tuscarora Nation, I apologize for not remembering the exact location. But it was this massive conflict that happened because for years the Tuscarora had been raiding their allies. Sorry, not allies, raiding their enemies uh, for captives, which they would then take to British markets to sell into slavery. Because the first enslaved individuals that were used by Europeans in the Americas were actually Native Americans, started by
Yes.
Columbus. And it continued for quite a while. But eventually the Tuscarora caught on that it's like, this could eventually happen to us too. So they sort of they decided, we're going to stop participating in this, enslavement of Native Americans, and we're going to fight against the British colonists. And there's a lot more to that, and I talk about the more complexities and nuances in the video. But the long and short of it, that was one of the biggest factor was the Native American slavery in the Americas. And the Tuscarora eventually did lose. The British had the help of the Cherokee and the Yamasee as well. And then
Yeah.
after, literally, and I'm not making this up, literally immediately after the Tuscarora War ended, the Yamasee did the exact same thing. The Yamasee were like,
Yeah.
"Oh no, this could happen to us also," and so they turned around and did the same thing. Again, the main concern was Native Americans, the enslavement of
Yeah.
Native Americans, and then they were defeated as well. So these two wars led to the uh, the British colonies to begin phasing out Native American slavery in favor of enslaved Africans. Now, as anyone who knows about the 1619 Project knows, yes, enslaved Africans had been in the Americas since 1619, but they were not. It was in chattel enslavement of Africans was not as big as it was until after the Tuscarora War took place, when they
Well,
started.
and that's one of
Yeah,
the problems with the
yeah,
1619 project. I mean,
yeah,
as sympathetic as I am to as
yeah,
sympathetic as I am to it, it oversimplifies things.
yeah,
Um,
exactly.
and that's one of them, is that you can't, it's important to center
Mhm.
chattel slavery and the unique development of chattel slavery in the American context, and its connection to
Yeah,
racism, and that direct core key relationship to American history. You can't deny that.
yeah,
But what you can't do is ignore these other influences that are part of the story. And
yeah,
the enslavement of indigenous people is one of the big ones, and how that's impacted by King Philip's War, how that's impacted by Bacon's Rebellion, that's how
yeah,
because of the and how that's impacted by the Tuscarora War. But there is this fascination not with the 1619 project, but with a lot of historians that just want to focus on white conflicts. I mean that
Yeah,
so Bacon's rebellion gets so much attention because it is the single largest um, colonial rebellion. But King Philip's War is
yeah,
a bigger conflict, and you might make the argument that the Tuscarora War is also a bigger conflict, is a larger war in
yeah,
terms of destruction, in terms of cost,
yeah,
in terms of casualties. That these conflicts are are directly related to what we're talking about. They're directly related to the development of American history and to its evolution. But because they are not colonial rebellions, so
yeah,
instead you'll focus on Bacon's Rebellion, focus on sort of the Catholic uprising not that long later in Maryland.
yeah,
You focus on these kind of things, but you're not focusing on the kind of stuff that you're talking about, and so
yeah,
that help that and that's just because of how the American narrative has focused almost entirely upon the
mm,
white experience and the white and sort of the that the white experience was normative. And so like but the great value of projects like the 1619 project, the 1619 project in particular, is that it makes us start asking questions
yeah.
about the other influences. So we can start bringing in, and the next big one to bring in is the indigenous perspective.
Yeah, yes, and like I said, and to continue on that same thread, one of the other things I wanted to touch on, one of the things I brought up in my video on the American Revolution is how wars like the Tuscarora War and the King Philip's War sort of began to breed the this
Don't forget Lord Dunmore's War.
Lord, yes, Lord Dunmore's War, but that I mentioned that in the video, but I'm more talking about the breeding of staunch like independence in the British
Oh,
colony.
sure.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and that would be Tuscarora War and King Philip's War, and also the Anglo-Powhatan Wars.
Yeah.
Those conflicts really
Oh, sure.
the colonists were essentially by themselves and really saw little to no actual support. Not support. Sorry, little to no actual uh, help from the British Crown. The British Crown sort of gave lip service, but they didn't actually oftentimes didn't actually send in, for example, regular, professional soldiers. It was just the militia that was handling it. So the colonies felt that they were sort of on their own. But
Well, and this idea that there is
yeah,
that both of those conflicts end up creating creating a set of circumstances
yeah,
um, in which European colonizers and their descendants feel like they own the land. There
yeah,
there isn't a sense of shared space, even
yeah,
if that sharing is even if that sharing is highly conditional based upon the circumstances with indigenous peoples before these conflicts. It's still a kind of shared space. At least there are
yeah,
shared interests involved. Now, the British government, whether it's under Walpole or later, they just want it to be quiet.
yeah.
Just shut up and grow tobacco. Stop it.
And
We
well, and,
just,
and also to be fair, uh, for example, through like the Pequot War and the Anglo
mm,
and the last couple of Anglo-Powhatan wars. To be fair, the 40 Years' War was still the not 40 Years' War, the 30 Years' War was
yeah,
still going on very strong during that conflict. So to be fair, Britain, which was part of
they
that
got things
conflict,
to do.
that they had
Right.
things to do, sort of like the Napoleonic Wars and things like that. But um, so to be fair in that there was a reason that they didn't. It's like we can't spare professional soldiers when we're having to stop Spain and the whole Roman Empire from
Yeah.
killing people. But um you know, but it still happened. But where I think, and those are all very important conflicts: the King Philip's War, the Anglo-Powhatan War, and the Tuscarora War, and things like that. But one conflict that again, that sort of gets left behind in that uh, in that development of independence and sense of ownership of the land, uh, is the Anglo-Cherokee War. Because one of the Anglo-Cherokee War, which, and this is one of the things I really like about Tartar's book, is the Anglo-Cherokee War. The thing is, again, that was a case of during that war, the 7 Years' War was still going on, and so
Mhm.
North Carolina and South Carolina and Georgia were just essentially left to their own devices to have to fight off the Cherokee. Now, of course, the Cherokee, they were the wronged party. There's really no nuance about that. You can go into nuances about the rest of the war, but in some, the Cherokee were the ones who were wronged by the people that they were who were told that, like, we're your allies. um you know but the colonists were essentially left on their own, and so they had to fight this off, and so that's what eventually led to South Carolina being, one of the few southern colonies that was as staunchly
Yeah.
independent as Boston. Because Georgia was a very loyal colony. Georgia was not necessarily. I mean, there were Georgians who fought for the Continental Army, and were at the Continental Convention, but Georgia, by and large, was pretty quickly and pretty easily recaptured by Britain. Because
Not just
of it.
recaptured. Georgia was the only colony
Yeah,
in
yeah,
which Virginia was this close for it happening.
yeah,
Right, Dunmore was on his way back, but
yeah,
Georgia, in fact, returned
yeah,
to its original status.
yeah,
So
exactly.
it went back to just being 12 colonies.
Yeah, exactly, exactly. And so, there's a reason that South Carolina, there's a reason people like Nathaniel Greene, and
Mhm.
even though I think he's very overrated, Francis Marion and such developed, in South Carolina and North Carolina, and that's because of the Anglo-Cherokee War.
Yeah.
Also, in addition to this, because Tartara, again, one of the things I like about in his book, he also talks about the role of enslaved and free black people, because so
Yeah.
for context, one of the biggest fears that happened in the
Okay,
English
hold on, Dan. I
War.
assume I assume you're gonna edit this. I've got to wrap up soon. My son's nap is in about 5 minutes, so I've got to be
Okay,
there for
that's
that.
yeah, that's fine, that's fine. And we'll do that soon. But one of the things that he talks about in that is, like, for example, for one thing, Stoner's rebellion, the
Yeah.
Stoner rebellion and the African, the rebellion in South Carolina,
Yep.
just 20 or so years before the English-Cherokee War, and it was a big rebellion that resulted in all things like that. That was put down, but it instilled this fear of servile insurrection in South Carolina, and then eventually, um, leading into the Anglo-Cherokee War, that was one of the big fears, is because enslaved Africans would flee to Native American territory where they would be relatively equal and be set free. And so South Carolina colonies are like, oh no, this is going to cause servile insurrection. And so all of those together sort of led to, like, Britain, will you help us? And then Britain doesn't help. And so they're like, why would we help you?
Right.
Things like
If
that.
we're on our own, we're on our own.
Yeah. And then sort of the last thing I want to touch on is, I know you'll have to go into a little bit, because of your son's nap. But one of the things I want to touch on, public history, when it portrays people like, say, Thomas Jefferson and George Washington, because I think that's a very lacking a lot of times in itself. One good example I have is, literally 2 days ago, I was talking with a friend of mine who doesn't know a lot about Thomas Jefferson, and I was telling him, like, well, Thomas Jefferson was a surprisingly very militaristic president. I mean, he's the one who sends the U.S. Navy to attack Algiers in response to Barbary pirates. And a lot of people don't know that, prior to the one of the catalysts that eventually leads to the Louisiana Purchase is Jefferson and the U.S. military threatening to invade French territory
Hmm.
if they don't get their way. Now, I personally think that would have been a terrible idea. I think Napoleon would have just absolutely destroyed the U.S. military at the time. But that doesn't change the fact that he threatened it, and Napoleon was just like, sure, whatever, give me a bunch of money, and I'll leave you alone. And then, of course, George Washington's another good example of that, where he's sort of like portrayed as this paragon of U.S. law and government, when also at the same time being sort of a blundering. I don't want to say. Okay, he became a general for a reason. He became a very good general for a reason, but a lot of times in his early years, he was very blundering. I mean, he let himself get manipulated by the Seneca chief Tonagreason into eventually starting the 7 Years' War. because Tana Greason was sort of even extreme for among
Oh yeah, I mean
uh,
it's
he was extreme even among
yeah,
the Haudenosaunee. The Haudenosaunee sort of were like
yeah.
telling him to calm down. The Iroquois Confederacy. But he let himself get manipulated in that, and then he made a blunder eventually in the great in the war with the Great Northern Confederacy. Uh, that eventually led to St. Clair's defeat because actually Congress was telling him, "Don't do this. We can still negotiate with them." Congress is actually surprisingly willing to be like, "Hey, we're willing to compromise with them," and then Washington's like, "No, send in the U.S. military," and it backfired on them totally. So I think when it comes to portraying founding fathers, we need to stop looking at their idealized version and we need to look at how they actually
Yeah,
were. You
there's
know,
no honest history about these guys. Right?
yeah,
So when you're talking
yeah,
about Washington, you're absolutely right in all of
yeah,
these ways. That
yeah,
George Washington stumbles into the 17 Wars. He kills Hugh Monville. I mean,
yeah,
he that there is no Washington has no foundation for any kind of proper military leadership or even a measure of success in military leadership
yeah,
other than what he said. I mean that
yeah,
he gets control of the Continental Army through performance, and that's a whole
yeah,
discussion. The uniform that he wears to the Continental Congress is not one in order to show that he's a military man. Is one that he made up. It's a part of an
yeah,
independent company that was created a week before so that he could wear a uniform. Um,
yeah.
so so an under and again, it's what I keep saying. It's the French who win the war for independence. It's not the
Yeah.
Americans.
Well,
But then with Jefferson, you also have to look at in terms of their use of the military. You have to look at what he does as governor too. It's not just what he does as president because
yeah,
there are these and particularly because what he's doing as governor is that he's organizing the expeditions against indigenous peoples. I mean,
oh,
this is
and
how he develops his relationship with George Rogers Clark.
he's also the first person to suggest Indian removal. Uh,
Well, extinction.
yeah. Well, yeah,
It's the same letter. He says
yeah,
removal
and
beyond our borders
yeah,
without any kind of contact
yeah,
or extinction.
yeah,
Um.
yeah, yeah,
Oh, okay. This is Thomas Jefferson.
yeah. And then and then another thing, because people often forget George Washington had other very good commanders to help him. One commander that's often
Well,
forgotten is Joseph Louis Cook, uh, who was a Onondaga uh,
yeah.
soldier colonel. He was his colonel, and he was also one of the people who was actually sent by Washington to negotiate with Rochambeau and the French. And he also won a lot of Washington's key battles. He's not the only one, of course. Benedict Arnold's another good example. But then you also have even though
His best
Benedict,
command.
yeah, even though Benedict Arnold did famously eventually defected and things like that. But not just that. Then you have
But yeah, if without
yeah,
Saratoga, America
yeah,
doesn't win.
yeah,
Without Arnold, there's no Saratoga.
yeah.
So who cares what he does after
Yeah,
that?
yeah, exactly. And then in the South you have Nathaniel Greene. And again, this is where I will always harp on this.
Rhode Island's own.
Francis Marion has I would argue has only become popular one because he's from South Carolina and he's a South Carolina hero, but two, he's only become popular because of the Patriot because Mel Gibson's
Yeah,
character is based on Francis Marion. But
yeah.
Francis Marion played a very small role in the actual revolution itself. He was a colonel to Nathaniel Greene, and Nathaniel Greene is the one who was like, "Hey, let's use instead of meeting the British head on, let's use Fabian tactics. Let's attack
Well, see, that's
what's
it, right? I
favorable
mean,
and things like that."
without Greene in the South and without Greene's understanding of
Yeah,
Cornwallis's
yeah,
weaknesses, he just outmaneuvers
yeah,
Cornwallis,
yeah, and
because
he, yeah,
his head is right there and he knows what he's doing.
yeah, exactly.
So as soon as as Greene takes over from Gates, the entire Southern theater
Yeah,
changes, and you've got
yeah,
somebody who, in fact, understands what's going on the ground, who can use his
yep,
resources, but also understands that Cornwallis can't use his. He doesn't
yeah,
understand that what there are things called supply lines,
yeah,
and you can't
yeah.
just keep going.
Yeah, yeah, and it's because of Nathaniel Greene's tactics that lead to Cornwallis, you know, uh,
Ending up in Virginia, yeah.
ending up in Yorktown, and because before then, again, the British were winning more strategic victories than the Continental Army was, and they had help because another figure I think is far too often ignored is Dragging Canoe, the Cherokee chief who fought
Mm.
on the side of the British. He plays a key part in helping the British retake Augusta and
Mm.
Savannah and Athens and several other
Yeah, right.
cities in Georgia. He inflicts several key defeats against the British, and then continues to fight against the U.S. well after, and never surrenders.
Right.
He dies of old age, and then the war sort of the American Cherokee War just sort of ends at a draw. Again, the Americans claim we won, but if you look at the actual course of the war, it was more like the American soldiers marching to Cherokee territory, burned down a couple of towns. The Cherokee marching to U.S. territory, burned down a couple of towns, and then it just no one ever gains anything from it. It's a
Right.
whole thing. I did a video on that, but so without Nathaniel Greene, those victories would just kept stacking up.
Yeah.
Without Louis Cook, the French would not have
Yeah.
come in. Which also,
All overshadowed by telling
yeah,
too many stories about how great a leader George Washington
yeah,
was.
yes. Which brings me into my very last point. I wanted to make sure I covered. A lot of people like to point out, for example, you've harped on this for a long time, the democracy and things like that, and they like to point out, oh, they look to Rome and things like that. It's like, not really. I mean, yeah, sure, in the architecture, but if you look at the actual letters of Franklin, Jefferson, Madison, Thomas Paine, etc., and I actually took screenshots of these letters and documents and these
Mhm.
debates and put them in my video on the American Revolution. Thomas Jefferson, Madison, Franklin, etc., all of them repeatedly state um, that their main inspirations for how they want the American government to develop are one, the German states, because Jefferson and Paine both state very clearly the German states have quote unquote more freedom than which is not necessarily true, but that's what they stated, and they stated very clearly in their speeches. And then they also talk about the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. They very
Sure.
clearly state that, like, hey, we should base our government off of them. Again, Jefferson states because they have more freedom and less rules and yada yada yada, which is not necessarily true, but that's his perception of it. That's Jefferson's perception of it. In fact, there were a Mohawk delegation in 1775 to the Continental Congress where all of them are saying,
Mhm.
hey, we remember a few years ago, I forget the name of the Mohawk leader in the 1740s who told the colonists, like, hey, you should adopt a government style sort of like ours. But they tell that delegation, like, we remember what he said and we're with you in arms. And they continue that debate even into the continental debates. Again, they state it very clearly where they're all like, hey, Thomas Paine says, hey, we shouldn't base our government off of anything in Europe because that's full of corruption and evil. We need to base it off of, you know, this over here, the Native American
Yeah,
form.
Paine is the clearest about that
Yeah,
of all of
yeah,
them.
yeah, of all of them. Now, there. This is Stoermer, as Stoermer will tell you, this is a heavily debated subject among revolutionary historians. There are multiple papers where,
It
like,
shouldn't be.
it shouldn't be, but there are people who were like, oh no, there was one where it's like, where's proof, a paper where it was like titled something like where's the proof or something like that, and then a response to that were like, oh, how do you define proof, and they're like, well, here's all our proof, but you're not
Well,
defining proof and things
this
like
this,
that.
this is one of the things, and I think this is sort of a nice way to kind of wrap it up.
Yeah,
That
yeah,
Jefferson is valuable on occasion,
yeah,
and his correspondence with Adams in the
yeah,
18 teens and 1820s is when they're talking about the revolution is important. And
yeah,
when Adams asks him in a letter who can write the history of the revolution,
yeah,
and Jefferson says nobody.
yeah,
No one can ever write the history of the American Revolution, and you can't write the history of the Revolution because nobody will ever be able to write and share what went on behind closed doors,
yeah,
what went on in our
exactly.
conversation. All they're going to be able to do is read it from, and this is rich for Jefferson to say, right? Because he
Yeah,
made so much out of it, but from what we wrote down. But that's not the revolution. This is exactly the kind of thing you're talking about when you're
yeah,
talking about, well, we need to have specific evidence of this, but again, absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. That
yeah,
we can actually see from the nature of the structures they developed. We can
yeah,
trace influences, but we've got to be very careful by really saying that everything that we got is everything that there was.
yeah,
And so if somebody's asking you for evidence about this, you can
yeah,
you can point to. I mean, there's a burden that you have in drawing the conclusion, and everything is just kind of our nearest and best version of the truth
yeah,
of what happened. But in the end, we've got to always understand that there are more and broader and other influences on the kind of structures that they created, on the evidence that they had, and including sort of the indigenous examples and the confederacies that are absolutely, it's because they're a part of their lived experience too,
Yeah,
of the people who were actively engaged with them. And to say that that experience did not influence their practice
yeah.
is I think irresponsible.
Especially when you compare how, like, for example, our not three party system, our system of government, judicial, executive, etc., and compare it to how similar it is to the Haudenosaunee thing, where they had a very similar thing, the judicial versus the executive, and on and on and on. So it's like we can see those things, and the key factor is when we're talking about the influences of the American Revolution, is we're not saying that there was one singular influence.
Well, right. We've got
Different,
to, but we've got to have the discussion
yeah,
about what all of these influences
yeah,
were,
exactly,
and
exactly,
not exclude. Again, it's
yeah,
another case of just
yeah,
oversimplifying and saying, "Oh
yeah,
my gosh, it comes from them writing about them thinking about Rome or them
yeah, yeah,
thinking about Greece." Five guys who have a classical education talking about this stuff, avoiding how many people are involved in the political
yeah,
development of the colonies
yeah,
into a government, and all of their education and their experience and what
yeah,
they're bringing to the table. And that's stuff that we are just now being able to recover, that
yeah,
leads to
exactly,
the kind of conversations that you're interested in having that are
yeah,
really valuable.
yeah, yeah, exactly. So overall, I think this was a good, that is a nice succinct way to end it. We need to have a much more diverse conversation, which is where public
Mm-hmm.
history comes in. And
Yeah.
unfortunately, again, public history, sometimes fails because you get people like, for example, a conversation for another video, but still something that sort of fits in the public history thing. Oh, America was a Christian nation, was founded,
Yeah, that's a whole video, right? I mean, that's
yeah,
a whole nother conversation.
which,
But what I think is
yeah,
actually the benefit of public history is
yeah,
that this is one of the points about
yeah,
identifying the points that need attention, right? There are, what I mentioned before was
yeah,
that you identify the weak points that people want to know more about, but you also can identify kind of the peaks where people are doing the most misrepresentation.
yeah,
And then, so those are the points that you actually need to go after too. So you can go after
yep,
and be part of the solution in trying to help people understand something that is under understood, like democracy versus a republic.
yeah,
Or you can go to where people are actually doing the most misrepresentation, the most twisting, and and make sure you're attacking it. And that's absolutely positively one of them.
yeah, yes, absolutely positively one of them.
But
But
only public history can do that because
yeah,
academic
yeah,
history isn't responsive to what's going on right now.
yeah,
Whereas public history, by definition, is responsive to what's going on right now.
yeah, exactly. Which is why I do my YouTube, you do your TikTok, among other public history things. And for example, I actually engage with people when they comment on my videos on my YouTube. Now, to be fair, my YouTube's still relatively small, so I'm actually able to do that. Versus if I have 100,000 people, commenting all at once.
Yeah, I can't keep up.
Yeah,
I
yeah,
need to find a
exactly.
way to keep up. I can't
Yeah,
keep up.
exactly. But the point is, it still is a lot easier than, say, an
Yeah,
academic paper, which are useful and we should not do away with. But public history is where we can bring that in. Public history is where we can
yeah.
show, like, oh, here's Thomas Adams, sorry, John Adams, uh, saying that, like, in the Treaty of Tripoli, the United States is not founded on Christianity, yada yada yada.
Well,
Thomas
right, right.
and Madison,
Here's the whole thing, right? Read
yeah,
the whole letter and understand what
yeah,
Adams actually means when he
yeah,
says that. Understand his own understanding of
yeah,
religion and
or
Christianity before
yeah,
you start deploying that in some sort of evangelical way.
yeah,
It makes no sense.
or Madison and Jefferson repeatedly talking about how important separation of church and state is, and why church should stay out of government, things like that. Yeah. So that's why public history is very important. Is to re-educate, not re-educate. Sorry, that has a dark connotation to it. Educate people properly.
We can
on
refine. We
Yeah,
can
refine.
refine our understanding.
Yeah. So that's why public history is important. So thank you, Tad, for coming on. And
Thank you
so
so much, Dane. This has been a
yeah.
pleasure.
Oh yeah, no problem at all. And you have fun with your sons.
I know. We will pick this up later, but thank you
Yeah,
very
thank
much.
you.
This has been a
Thank,
real pleasure.
yeah, thank you. All right.
Bye bye.
Bye.